Up until a few years ago, I'd never even thought about going hunting. I'd never owned a gun. I'd never even shot at a target, much less a bird. But then one day, we were at our house, kind of having an impromptu block party, and a few of my neighbors were sitting over in the corner of the garage, and I walked by, and they were talking about some of their latest hunting and fishing escapades. And one of my neighbors jokingly looked at me and said, "Hey, Dave, you should go get your hunter safety card, and then you can come on our next hunting trip." And they all kind of laughed, like they just thought, it's not something I'd be interested in. I'd never want to do it. And I remember going to bed that night and thinking to myself, I'm going to do it. And so I went and I took this class in the back of some sporting goods store, learned all about how not to shoot myself in the foot. And I showed up a few weeks later with my hunter safety card, and I said, "All right, guys, when's our next trip?" And so they took me out. And we went and left for 3 days. And it was an incredible experience on a number of levels. I'll never forget that first morning. I came walking out of the room, and they just looked at me, and they just shook their heads, and they walked over, and they started to dress me. They started to show, hey, that pattern of camo you only wear on days like this, and here's how you wear that hat. And it felt like I was a little kid being dressed by these men. And then we went out, and it was dark that day, and we started to walk and get into position, and they started to yell, "Stop! That's not how you walk. Look where the twigs are. Avoid those and be downwind." And it felt so awkward to be in that moment. I'm used to being in moments where I'm mentoring somebody or coaching somebody or trying to help them out. And so to be the person who was in somebody else's world, a group of other people's world, felt so strange. But as I look back on what happened over those 3 days, I realized that trip accelerated my friendships and the bonds that I have with those guys in a very, very profound way. And the reason is because I was willing to be vulnerable. I was willing to go into their world and to allow them to give me advice and to help coach me up on actually how this is done. Now, I think the same thing is true with relationships in general. Have you ever had a friend who's really helped you out in a time of need? Or who's maybe walked through a big decision with you? And then you turn the tables on them and say, "Hey, what can I do to help?" And they just kind of go, "Oh, I'm good." Then the next time you're with them again, you ask them, "Hey, how are things going?" "Things are great." And over, that seems to be a pattern. I've had friendships like that, and they've been good to an extent, but there's always a ceiling on relationships that tend to be one-way streets. Real relationships of depth, are ones that are two-way streets. They're reciprocal. And so one of the best things that we can learn how to do in our neighborhoods is to learn the art of receiving. When I first started down this road, thinking about how to best engage my neighbors, I started looking around my block and thinking, oh, there's a widow that lives right there, and her fence is starting to fall down, and so I wonder if we can get a few people and go and rebuild that fence. And there's a kid down the block, and his dad doesn't live in town, and so maybe we can do a better job of inviting him over more often into the life of our family. And those are really, really good things. But just as important as looking for ways to serve our neighbors is the art of actually going and looking for ways that they could serve us, to create some of those two-way street relationships with the people that live closest to us. And this means that we need to become aware of our own needs and our own deficits. Rarely do we find ourselves advertising our weaknesses. It's something that most of us figure out a way to cover up or to move beyond. But the truth is that God became weak so that we could be strong. And when we start to identify areas of weakness, areas of need, we allow other people to have dignity as they begin to serve us. So this week, we want to encourage you to take some time to actually list out specific needs or deficits that you have. Maybe it's asking someone for advice about lawn care or gardening. Maybe it's going and just borrowing something that you have a legitimate need for. Now, don't make up something that you need to borrow like that. That's weird, and it'll get even weirder when your neighbor comes over after you've borrowed their shovel 4 or 5 times, and then they see your shovel sitting in the garage. So try to do this with some authenticity and just out of the course of your normal life. This doesn't come naturally. Most of us, we have this ingrained habit of trying to cover up a weakness or move beyond it. But when we do this, what we're doing is we're creating vulnerability, and we're creating a space where others can serve us as well as we can serve them. And when we do that, good things happen.